October 17, 2024. West Hollywood, California. A demolition crew was preparing to gut the interior of a three-story commercial building on North Harper Avenue, just half a block south of Sunset Boulevard. The structure had stood since 1947, originally housing a nightclub on the ground floor with offices above, later converted to storage space that had remained largely untouched since the mid-1980s. The October morning was warm and cloudless, the kind of Southern California day that made the past feel impossibly distant. Foreman Daniel Reyes had been in the demolition business for 22 years, and he had learned to expect the unexpected when opening up old buildings in this part of Los Angeles. The Harper Building, as it was known on the original permits, had been purchased by a development company planning to convert the structure into luxury condominiums. The building's history was largely forgotten, though records showed it had once been called the Starlight Lounge, a mid-century cocktail bar that attracted a clientele from the nearby Sunset Strip. Reyes and his crew of 8 men had spent the previous week clearing out decades of accumulated debris, old furniture, filing cabinets filled with yellowed documents, and the remnants of businesses long since vanished. The basement level, however, had proven difficult to access, with the original staircase having been sealed with concrete sometime in the past. The concrete seal that blocked the basement stairs was not original to the building. Reyes could see that clearly as his crew examined the work. The pour was professional, but distinctly different from the 1940s construction visible elsewhere in the structure. Someone had deliberately closed off the basement, and the work appeared to have been done sometime in the 1960s or early 70s, based on the aggregate composition and weathering patterns. When Reyes reported this anomaly to the project manager, the decision was made to proceed with removal. The development plans called for excavating the basement to create underground parking, so whatever lay below would need to be addressed regardless. The concrete barrier was approximately 18 inches thick and required a jackhammer to penetrate. As the first chunks fell away, Reyes noticed something strange. Instead of the musty basement air he expected, there was a sealed quality to what lay beyond, as if the space had been hermetically closed for decades. His crew widened the opening to approximately 3 feet in diameter, enough to shine a flashlight into the darkness below. What the beam revealed caused Reyes to immediately order his men back from the hole. In the basement, covered in decades of dust, sat the unmistakable shape of an automobile, its chrome trim catching the flashlight beam like buried treasure. Reyes called the West Hollywood Sheriff's Station at 11:42 that morning. His voice was calm, but urgent as he explained what appeared to be a vintage car entombed in a sealed basement. Within 30 minutes, 2 deputies arrived at the scene, and what they discovered, through the widened opening, transformed a demolition project into an active crime scene. The vehicle was a Cadillac, its distinctive tail fins and elongated body marking it as a 1960s model. But it was not the car itself that prompted the deputies to call for detectives and forensic investigators. Through the dusty rear window, partially visible on the back seat, were what appeared to be human remains. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department Homicide Bureau took control of the scene by 2 o'clock that afternoon. Detective Sergeant Maria Vasquez, a 23-year veteran who specialized in cold cases, arrived with a team of forensic investigators and crime scene technicians. The concrete opening was carefully expanded to allow controlled access to the basement. Portable lighting was brought in, along with air quality monitors and protective equipment. As the investigation team descended into the sealed chamber, for the first time in what appeared to be over 50 years, they documented every detail. The basement measured approximately 40 feet by 60 feet, with concrete walls, floor, and ceiling. There was no other entrance or exit besides the sealed staircase. The Cadillac dominated the underground space. It was a 1967 Coupe de Ville, finished in what had once been Venetian blue metallic paint, now dulled by decades of dust, but remarkably preserved in the stable underground environment. The vehicle's license plates were still attached, the California registration tags showing an expiration date of February 1971. The car sat on deflated tires, their rubber cracked and deteriorated, but still holding their shape. The chrome remained largely intact, protected from the elements in this unlikely tomb. The odometer, visible through the dusty windshield, read 32,417 miles. Inside the vehicle, on the rear bench seat, lay the skeletal remains of a human being. The body was in a reclined position, as if the person had been placed there after death. The skeleton was intact and largely articulated, suggesting that decomposition had occurred in place over many decades. Nearby, investigators found what appeared to be remnants of clothing. The fibers largely deteriorated, but still identifiable as a man's suit. A leather belt with a distinctive brass buckle lay near the pelvis. Near the skull, a gold ring was visible, along with what appeared to be a wristwatch, its crystal cracked, but the metal case still recognizable as a Rolex Datejust. The forensic team worked through the night, meticulously documenting and photographing every aspect of the scene before any evidence was moved or collected. Dr. Chen Wei, a forensic anthropologist from UCLA called in to consult, made preliminary assessments of the remains. The skeleton appeared to be that of an adult male, approximately 5 feet 10 inches to 6 feet tall, with robust bone structure suggesting a muscular build in life. The skull showed evidence of significant trauma, with what appeared to be at least 2 bullet wounds to the posterior portion, suggesting the victim had been shot from behind at close range. The damage was consistent with large-caliber ammunition. Additional evidence scattered around the vehicle painted a grim picture. A woman's high-heeled shoe was found near the driver's side door. Red leather with a distinctive gold buckle. The style, placing it firmly in the late 1960s. A matching shoe was never recovered, nor were any other remains found in the basement. The shoe suggested that a second person, a woman, had been present when the vehicle was placed in the basement. Whether she had escaped, been killed elsewhere, or met some other fate remained an immediate mystery. Investigators also noted scratch marks on the interior of the trunk, though it was empty when examined. The vehicle identification number traced to a registered owner whose name had long since faded from public memory. The 1967 Coupe de Ville had been purchased new from a Cadillac dealership in Hollywood in March of that year. The registered owner was listed as Vincent Anthony Moretti, with an address on North Laurel Avenue in West Hollywood. A check of historical records revealed that Moretti had been reported missing in January of 1970, along with his wife, Carla Marie Moretti. The couple had vanished without a trace over 50 years earlier, and their disappearance had never been solved. The discovery on North Harper Avenue was about to reopen one of Los Angeles's forgotten cold cases. The missing persons report, filed on January 14, 1970, had been submitted by Carla Moretti's sister, Teresa Giordano. According to the original report, the Morettis had failed to appear at a family gathering on January 11th and could not be reached by telephone. When Teresa visited their apartment on North Laurel Avenue on January 13th, she found the door unlocked, the couple's personal belongings undisturbed, and no sign of either Vincent or Carla. Their Cadillac was also missing. The case had remained open but inactive for over 5 decades. Detective Vasquez requested the complete case file from the Sheriff's Department archives. What arrived was a weathered cardboard box containing approximately 300 pages of documents, photographs, and investigative notes from the original 1970 investigation. The file revealed that Vincent Moretti had been a person of interest to law enforcement long before his disappearance. He had been identified in FBI surveillance reports as an associate of the Los Angeles crime family, the organization that had controlled organized crime in Southern California since the 1920s. Moretti's specific role had never been precisely defined, but informants had placed him at meetings with known mob figures throughout the 1960s. The Harper Building itself had a history that intersected with Los Angeles's organized crime past. Built in 1947, it had originally housed the Starlight Lounge, a nightclub that operated until 1965. City records showed that the Starlight had been owned by a holding company traced to associates of Jack Dragna, the longtime boss of the Los Angeles family, who had died in 1956. After the club closed, the building changed hands multiple times, eventually being converted to storage space in 1972. The basement had apparently been sealed sometime between 1970 and 1972, coinciding almost exactly with the Moretti's disappearance. The Sunset Strip, just steps from the Harper Building, had been the epicenter of Los Angeles nightlife for decades. In the 1940s and 50s, legendary clubs like Ciro's, the Mocambo, and the Trocadero had attracted Hollywood royalty and organized crime figures alike. By the late 1960s, the Strip had transformed into a different kind of playground, with rock clubs and counterculture venues replacing the old glamour. But beneath the surface, the connections between entertainment, money, and organized crime continued to operate. Vincent Moretti had apparently navigated this world, and it had ultimately consumed him. The West Hollywood location was significant for another reason. Unlike the city of Los Angeles proper, West Hollywood had remained unincorporated until 1984, meaning it fell under the jurisdiction of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department rather than the LAPD. This jurisdictional quirk had historically made the area attractive for certain activities that might draw more scrutiny in the city itself. Gambling, prostitution, and other vice operations had flourished in the unincorporated Strip throughout the 20th century. The men who profited from these enterprises operated in the shadows of the famous clubs and restaurants that lined Sunset Boulevard. The discovery in the Harper Building basement was about to reveal a story that had been buried for more than half a century. Vincent Moretti's remains had finally been found, but the mystery of what happened to his wife Carla remained unsolved. A single red high-heeled shoe was the only trace of her presence. As Detective Vasquez began reviewing the decades-old case file, she knew that the answers would require digging not just through physical evidence, but through the complex history of Los Angeles organized crime during one of its most volatile periods. The Sunset Strip had kept its secrets for 54 years. Now, those secrets were finally beginning to surface. The investigation would require understanding a world that no longer existed in quite the same form. A world of mob-connected nightclubs, territorial disputes, and the dangerous intersection of organized crime with legitimate business. The 1960s and early 70s had been a period of transition for the Los Angeles crime family, with old leadership giving way to new and outside forces pressing in from other cities. Vincent and Carla Moretti had somehow become entangled in this web, and it had cost Vincent his life. The question of what had happened to Carla and why the couple had been targeted would require tracing their story back to its beginning. Before we continue with this investigation, make sure you are subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in January of 1970 involves the Los Angeles organized crime family, the Cleveland Mafia's westward expansion, a glamorous couple who lived fast in the shadow of the Sunset Strip, and a betrayal that may have come from the person Vincent Moretti trusted most. By the end of this story, you will understand how a man and his Cadillac were entombed beneath a building for 54 years, and why the woman who vanished with him was never found. Vincent Anthony Moretti was born on March 12, 1934, in the Boyle Heights neighborhood of East Los Angeles. He was the second of 4 children born to Salvatore and Maria Moretti, Italian immigrants who had arrived in California in 1928. Salvatore worked as a longshoreman at the Port of Los Angeles, while Maria took in laundry and mending to supplement the family income. The Morettis lived in a small bungalow on Michigan Avenue, part of a tight-knit community of Italian and Jewish families that defined Boyle Heights during the Depression era. Vincent grew up speaking Italian at home and English in the streets, learning early the value of knowing how to navigate between different worlds. By his teenage years, Vincent had developed into a strikingly handsome young man. He stood 5 feet 11 inches tall, with broad shoulders, dark wavy hair, and brown eyes that neighbors later described as possessing an unsettling intensity. He was known for his immaculate dress even as a teenager, saving money from odd jobs to buy quality clothes that set him apart from his peers. His teachers at Roosevelt High School noted his intelligence but also his restlessness, his tendency to challenge authority and seek shortcuts. He dropped out during his junior year in 1951, telling his disappointed parents that he had found work that would provide more than any diploma ever could. The nature of that work became clear to federal investigators years later. Vincent had fallen in with a crew of young men connected to the gambling operations that flourished in East Los Angeles and the surrounding areas. These operations were controlled, directly or indirectly, by the Los Angeles crime family under the leadership of Jack Dragna. Vincent started as a runner, carrying betting slips and collecting payments. His reliability, his physical presence, and his ability to remain calm under pressure quickly earned him advancement. By 1954, at just 20 years old, he was managing a small bookmaking operation in the Lincoln Heights neighborhood, answering to mid-level figures in the Dragna organization. Vincent's rise within the organization was interrupted by a 2-year stint in the United States Army from 1955 to 1957. He served primarily at Fort Ord on the Monterey Peninsula, working as a supply clerk and avoiding overseas deployment. During this period, the Los Angeles crime family underwent significant changes. Jack Dragna died of a heart attack in February 1956, and leadership passed to Frank DeSimone, a lawyer-turned-mobster who would prove to be a controversial and ultimately weak boss. When Vincent returned to Los Angeles in late 1957, he found an organization in flux, with opportunities for ambitious young men willing to prove their loyalty to the new regime. Carla Marie Benedetto was born on September 3, 1938, in San Pedro, California, the daughter of a commercial fisherman and his homemaker wife. She grew up in the Italian fishing community that had existed in San Pedro since the turn of the century, a world of fishing boats, canneries, and traditional values. Carla was considered one of the most beautiful girls in her graduating class at San Pedro High School. With long dark hair, green eyes, and a vivacious personality that drew attention wherever she went, she dreamed of a life beyond the fishing docks of the glamorous Los Angeles she read about in magazines and saw in the movies. After graduating in 1956, Carla took a job as a cocktail waitress at a supper club in Torrance. Her beauty and charm made her popular with customers, and she quickly developed a sophisticated polish that belied her working-class origins. It was at this club, in the spring of 1958, that she first met Vincent Moretti. He was 24 years old, dressed in an expensive Italian suit, and exuding the confidence of a man who knew his place in the world. Carla was immediately captivated. Vincent, for his part, saw in Carla the kind of woman who could enhance his image as he continued to rise within the organization. The couple dated for nearly 2 years before marrying in January of 1960 at St. Peter's Italian Catholic Church in Los Angeles. The wedding was a lavish affair that drew guests from throughout the Italian community, including several figures that FBI surveillance teams photographed from across the street. Vincent's advancement within the crime family was evident in the quality of the guests and the expense of the celebration. The couple honeymooned in Las Vegas, where Vincent was introduced to contacts who would prove important in his future operations. When they returned to Los Angeles, they moved into a spacious apartment on North Laurel Avenue in West Hollywood, just minutes from the Sunset Strip. By the mid-1960s, Vincent Moretti had established himself as a valuable asset to the Los Angeles crime family. His primary responsibility was managing entertainment venues that served as fronts for gambling and loan sharking operations. The Starlight Lounge on North Harper Avenue was one of several establishments under his oversight. These clubs operated legitimate businesses while facilitating illegal gambling in back rooms and providing cover for the collection of loan shark payments. Vincent's role was to ensure smooth operations, handle problems before they escalated, and maintain relationships with the corrupt officials who allowed these activities to continue. Carla Moretti adapted to her role as a mob wife with apparent ease. She dressed elegantly, maintained their apartment with meticulous care, and accompanied Vincent to social functions where she charmed associates and their wives alike. But those who knew her well noticed a tension beneath the polished surface. Carla confided to her sister Theresa that Vincent's work kept him out late most nights, that he received phone calls at odd hours, and that he sometimes came home with bruised knuckles and no explanation. She never asked questions, having learned early in the marriage that curiosity was unwelcome. The glamorous life she had dreamed of came with shadows she had not anticipated. The 1967 Cadillac Coupe de Ville that Vincent purchased in March of that year was a symbol of his success. The Venetian blue metallic paint, the white leather interior, the power windows and air conditioning represented the pinnacle of American luxury. Vincent paid cash, nearly $6,000, at a Hollywood dealership where the sales staff knew better than to ask questions about the source of such funds. He drove the Cadillac with obvious pride, parking it prominently outside the clubs he managed, letting everyone know that Vincent Moretti had arrived. Carla loved that car almost as much as her husband did, the way it glided down Sunset Boulevard, the way people looked when they pulled up to the best restaurants. The couple's lifestyle appeared comfortable, even luxurious by the standards of their family's working-class origins. They dined at Chasen's and the Brown Derby, attended shows at the Coconut Grove, and spent occasional weekends in Palm Springs. Vincent wore custom-tailored suits from a shop on Wilshire Boulevard and gave Carla jewelry that her sister later described as inappropriate for a man who claimed to work in the restaurant business. But appearances could be deceiving. FBI surveillance reports from the period indicate that Vincent was increasingly concerned about his position within the organization during 1968 and 69. The Los Angeles crime family was struggling during this period. Frank DeSimone's death in August 1967 had left a leadership vacuum that was filled by Nick Licata, an aging boss who faced challenges on multiple fronts. The LAPD's Organized Crime Intelligence Division had become increasingly aggressive, while families from other cities, particularly Chicago and Cleveland, were encroaching on traditional Los Angeles territory. Informants reported tension between factions loyal to different capos, with some advocating for more aggressive expansion and others counseling caution. Vincent Moretti, who had built relationships across factional lines, found himself in an increasingly precarious position. The trouble for the Morettis began in earnest in the summer of 1969. According to documents in the reopened case file, Vincent had become involved in a dispute over the division of profits from a gambling operation in the San Fernando Valley. The operation had been generating significant revenue, and there were accusations that Vincent had been skimming more than his authorized share. These accusations came from individuals with connections to out-of-state interests, specifically a faction with ties to the Cleveland crime family that had been attempting to establish a foothold in Southern California. Vincent dismissed the accusations when they first reached him, confident that his years of loyal service would protect him. He had known Nick Licata since the late 50s and had provided valuable services to the organization throughout the 60s. But the rules of the underworld were changing. The traditional bonds of loyalty that had once governed mob relationships were eroding under pressure from law enforcement and competition. Younger members were more ruthless, less bound by the old codes, and the outsiders from Cleveland cared nothing for Vincent's history or his connections. They saw an opportunity to eliminate a rival and expand their influence. Carla sensed that something was wrong in the final months of 1969. Vincent became increasingly anxious, checking the rearview mirror constantly when they drove, refusing to go certain places he had previously frequented. He installed a second lock on their apartment door and began keeping a revolver in the nightstand drawer. When Carla asked what was troubling him, he told her it was business problems, nothing she needed to worry about. But she noticed that he had stopped wearing the expensive Rolex she had given him for their anniversary, as if he wanted to appear less successful, less worth targeting. The last confirmed sighting of Vincent and Carla Moretti alive occurred on the evening of January 10, 1970. They were seen leaving their apartment building around 7:30 in the evening, Vincent in a dark suit and overcoat, Carla, in a red dress and matching high heels. A neighbor remembered them because they seemed to be in good spirits, Vincent holding the car door open for Carla with the old-fashioned courtesy that characterized their relationship. The blue Cadillac pulled away from the curb and headed west toward Sunset Boulevard. Neither Vincent nor Carla Moretti was ever seen alive again. The next morning, when Vincent failed to arrive for a scheduled meeting at one of the clubs he managed, calls were made to the apartment on North Laurel Avenue. There was no answer. By evening, associates were growing concerned, though not yet alarmed. It was not unheard of for men in Vincent's line of work to disappear for a day or two without explanation. But when a second day passed with no word, and then a third, it became clear that something had happened. Teresa Giordano, growing frantic after repeated failed attempts to reach her sister, finally went to the apartment on January 13th and found it empty. The Morettis' lives frozen in place, as if they had simply stepped out for the evening and never returned. The official missing persons report filed on January 14, 1970, would remain the primary document in a case that went nowhere for over 50 years. The original investigators had their suspicions about what had happened to the Morettis, but proving those suspicions was another matter entirely. The blue Cadillac had vanished along with its owners. No bodies were ever found. No witnesses came forward. And in the world of organized crime, silence was enforced with the most permanent of persuasions. The Morettis had simply ceased to exist, absorbed into the long list of unsolved disappearances that marked the violent history of Los Angeles. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department assigned 2 detectives to investigate the Moretti disappearance in January of 1970. Detective Sergeant Harold Brennan and Detective Michael Fitzgerald were experienced investigators who understood immediately that this case would be complicated by the victim's apparent connections to organized crime. The apartment on North Laurel Avenue yielded few clues. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of struggle, and nothing to suggest where the couple might have gone on the evening of January 10th. The only unusual detail was that Carla's jewelry box, which her sister said normally contained several valuable pieces, was found empty. The investigation focused initially on the standard possibilities for a missing persons case. Had the Morettis left voluntarily, perhaps fleeing debts or legal troubles? Had they been the victims of random violence, caught up in the increasing crime that plagued Los Angeles in the early 1970s? Or had their disappearance been connected to Vincent's known associations with organized crime figures? The detectives pursued each theory, interviewing neighbors, associates, and family members. The picture that emerged was of a couple who had been increasingly fearful in the weeks before their disappearance, though neither had confided specific concerns to anyone outside their immediate circle. FBI agents from the Los Angeles field office took an interest in the case within weeks of the disappearance. They had been monitoring Vincent Moretti as part of their ongoing surveillance of the Los Angeles crime family, and had intelligence suggesting that his position within the organization had become precarious. Special Agent Thomas Kowalczyk shared information with the sheriff's investigators, indicating that there had been conflict between local mob figures and representatives of the Cleveland crime family over gambling territories. Vincent Moretti, according to informants, had been caught in the middle of this conflict and had made enemies on both sides. The Cleveland connection proved particularly interesting. The Cleveland crime family, under the leadership of John Scalish, had been expanding its influence into western states throughout the 1960s. Their interests had brought them into conflict with established Los Angeles operations, and several violent incidents had already occurred. Informants reported that Cleveland operatives had accused Vincent Moretti of interfering with their attempts to establish gambling operations in the San Fernando Valley. Whether these accusations had any basis in fact, or whether Vincent had simply become a convenient scapegoat, remained unclear. Detective Brennan's investigation identified several persons of interest, all of whom had potential motives and known connections to the criminal underworld. However, establishing probable cause for arrests proved impossible. Witnesses either refused to talk or provided alibis for the individuals in question. Physical evidence was non-existent. The blue Cadillac had vanished completely, and without the vehicle or the bodies, the detectives could not even prove conclusively that a crime had been committed. The case began to go cold within months of the disappearance, though it was never officially closed. The underworld, meanwhile, operated on its own timeline of justice. Within 2 years of the Moretti disappearance, 3 individuals who had been identified as persons of interest by investigators met violent ends. One was shot outside a bar in North Hollywood in November of 1970. Another died in a car bombing in Burbank in February of 1971. A third simply disappeared in March of that same year. His body never recovered. Whether these deaths were connected to the Moretti case or represented the normal attrition of organized crime could never be determined. Nick Licata, the boss of the Los Angeles crime family during the period of the Moretti's disappearance, died of natural causes in October of 1974. He was succeeded by Dominic Brooklier, who would lead the family through one of its most turbulent periods. The late 1970s saw the Los Angeles family weakened by federal prosecutions, informants, and competition from other criminal organizations. Jimmy Fratianno, the acting boss who had overseen operations during Brooklier's imprisonment, turned government witness in 1977, providing testimony that devastated the organization. Whatever secrets the family had kept about the Moretti disappearance remained buried beneath layers of criminal activity and prosecutorial attention. The Harper Building on North Harper Avenue continued to operate as a commercial property throughout the 1970s, though its days as a nightclub were over. The Starlight Lounge had closed in 1965, and the building had been purchased by a holding company that used it primarily for storage. The basement, sealed sometime in late 1970 or early 1971, according to construction experts who later examined the concrete work, was simply forgotten. New owners and new tenants came and went over the decades, none of them aware of what lay beneath their feet. The paperwork that might have explained why the basement was sealed had long since disappeared or been destroyed. Carla Moretti's family never stopped hoping for answers, even as the years turned to decades. Teresa Giordano, Carla's sister, filed annual requests with the Sheriff's Department asking about the status of the investigation. She received the same response each time. The case remained open but inactive, with no new leads or evidence. Teresa raised Carla's memory at every family gathering, displaying photographs of her beautiful sister and refusing to allow her to be forgotten. She died in 2008 at the age of 74, having never learned what happened to Carla and Vincent. The Sunset Strip itself underwent dramatic transformations in the decades following the Moretti's disappearance. The mob-connected nightclubs of the Golden Era gave way to rock venues that became famous in the 1960s and 70s, then to the hair metal scene of the 1980s. The old glamour faded, replaced by new forms of entertainment and new sources of money. The connections between organized crime and the entertainment industry became more subtle, more corporate, less visibly violent. The world that Vincent Moretti had navigated simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The former crime family associates, who might have known what happened to the Morettis, died one by one over the following decades. Some succumbed to natural causes, having lived into old age despite their violent histories. Others met violent ends, paying the ultimate price for their involvement in organized crime. And some, like Jimmy Fratianno, traded their secrets for government protection. Though Fratianno's extensive testimony about Los Angeles crime family operations made no mention of Vincent or Carla Moretti, if he knew what had happened to them, he took that knowledge to his grave when he died in 1993. Law enforcement's institutional memory of the case faded as well. Detective Brennan retired in 1982 and died of a stroke in 1990. Detective Fitzgerald transferred to another division in 1975, and later told colleagues that the Moretti case had haunted him throughout his career, representing one of the unsolved mysteries he most wished he could have cracked. The case files were transferred to archives, where they gathered dust alongside hundreds of other cold cases from the same era. Periodically, someone would request the files, review them, and find nothing new to pursue. The 1990s and 2000s brought advances in forensic technology that reopened many cold cases from earlier decades. DNA analysis, improved fingerprint techniques, and sophisticated database searches solved crimes that had seemed impossible to crack. But the Moretti case offered nothing for these new technologies to work with. There were no samples to test, no prints to match, no evidence preserved from the original investigation. The case remained stubbornly resistant to resolution, a mystery from an era when organized crime operated with near impunity, and witnesses were silenced before they could talk. West Hollywood, incorporated as a city in 1984, finally gaining its own municipal government and police force. The unincorporated territory that had once been a haven for vice operations became known for different reasons, emerging as a center of LGBTQ culture and progressive politics. The old nightclubs were replaced by new establishments, the old connections severed by time and changing circumstances. Few residents of the newly incorporated city knew anything about the mob history that had once defined the area just south of Sunset Boulevard. The Harper Building changed hands several times in the 1980s and 90s, each new owner using it for various commercial purposes without ever discovering its secrets. A vintage clothing store operated on the ground floor for several years in the late 80s. An art gallery occupied the space briefly in the mid-90s. Various storage and warehousing operations came and went. None of the owners or tenants had any reason to question why the basement had been sealed, and none attempted to access it. The building simply existed, ordinary and unremarkable, a minor property on a secondary street near the famous Sunset Strip. By the 2010s, the property had fallen into disrepair. The last commercial tenant had vacated in 2012, and the building sat empty for over a decade. Developers occasionally expressed interest, but the costs of renovation deterred serious offers. The building's historical significance was minimal. It was not old enough or architecturally distinctive enough to merit preservation. It seemed destined for eventual demolition, just another mid-century commercial structure that had outlived its usefulness in a city constantly reinventing itself. The development company that finally purchased the Harper Building in 2023 saw potential that others had missed. The location, just half a block from Sunset Boulevard, in an increasingly desirable neighborhood, justified the investment required to transform the structure into luxury condominiums. The developers obtained permits for extensive renovation that would gut the interior while preserving the basic structure. Archaeological surveys were not required for a building of this age and type. No one anticipated what the demolition crew would discover when they began opening up the long-sealed spaces. Vincent Moretti's family had largely dispersed by the time his remains were discovered. His parents had died in the 1980s, and his siblings had moved away from Los Angeles to various parts of the country. The Moretti name had faded from the local Italian-American community, remembered only by the oldest generation who could recall the ambitious young man who had married the beautiful girl from San Pedro, and then vanished without a trace. The reopening of the case would bring these scattered family members back into contact with a history they had tried to leave behind. The passage of 54 years had transformed not just the physical landscape, but the entire context in which the Moretti case would be investigated. The mob figures who had dominated Los Angeles in 1970 were dead or imprisoned. The code of silence that had once protected criminal operations had been broken by decades of informants and prosecutions. The witnesses who had refused to talk in 1970 were now beyond the reach of threats or inducements. If answers existed, they would have to come from the physical evidence that had been preserved in that sealed basement, and from the records and recollections that had survived the intervening decades. Detective Sergeant Maria Vasquez understood that solving this case would require a different approach than any investigation she had previously undertaken. She was not looking for living perpetrators or trying to build a case for prosecution. Everyone involved in whatever had happened to the Morettis was almost certainly dead. Her goal was simpler and in some ways more difficult: to understand what had happened, to identify the forces that had destroyed this couple, and to provide whatever closure might still be possible after more than half a century. The basement on North Harper Avenue had given up one of its secrets, but many questions remained unanswered. The forensic examination of Vincent Moretti's remains confirmed what investigators had suspected from the initial discovery. Dr. Chen Wei's analysis, completed in December of 2024, established cause of death as 2 gunshot wounds to the back of the skull, fired at close range with what ballistic experts determined was likely a .45 caliber pistol. The angle of the wounds suggested that Vincent had been kneeling or seated when he was shot, possibly executed while restrained. The position of the body on the rear seat of the Cadillac indicated that he had been placed there after death, arranged almost deliberately, as if his killers wanted to preserve some dignity even as they disposed of their victim. The Rolex date just found near Vincent's remains was traced through its serial number to a purchase made at a Beverly Hills jeweler in December of 1968. Records showed that Carla Moretti had bought the watch as a Christmas gift for her husband, paying in cash. The watch had stopped at 3:47, its battery long since depleted, providing no useful information about when Vincent had died. But its presence confirmed the identification, along with DNA samples that were matched to a distant relative who had submitted material to a genealogical database. Vincent Anthony Moretti had finally been found. The Cadillac itself proved to be a time capsule of evidence. In the glove compartment, investigators found registration documents, an owner's manual, and a small spiral notebook containing what appeared to be gambling records written in a simple code. The trunk contained a spare tire, a jack, and a woman's overnight bag packed with clothing and toiletries, as if Carla had been prepared for a trip. There was no blood evidence in the vehicle except in the rear seat area where Vincent's body had decomposed. This suggested that he had been killed elsewhere and transported to the Harper building for disposal. The single red high-heeled shoe remained the only physical evidence of Carla Moretti's presence at the scene. Its matching pair was never found, nor were any of her remains discovered, despite extensive searches of the basement and surrounding areas. Investigators developed several theories about what had happened to her. Perhaps she had been killed separately and disposed of elsewhere. Perhaps she had escaped and fled, taking on a new identity and disappearing into obscurity. Or perhaps she had been complicit in her husband's murder and had been spared, or even rewarded, for her cooperation. Detective Bosqu's investigation uncovered evidence supporting the darkest of these theories. FBI surveillance records from late 1969 indicated that Carla Moretti had been observed meeting with individuals connected to the Cleveland crime family, meetings that occurred without Vincent's apparent knowledge. Informant reports from the period suggested that Carla had become romantically involved with a Cleveland operative named Joseph Benedetto, possibly a distant relative given their shared surname. If true, this would suggest that Carla had betrayed her husband, setting him up for execution in exchange for her own survival. The motive for Vincent's murder became clearer as Vasquez assembled the historical record. The dispute over San Fernando Valley gambling operations had escalated throughout 1969, with Cleveland interests pressing aggressively to expand their presence. Vincent had been accused of skimming from operations that Cleveland claimed as their territory, an accusation that may or may not have been true. What was certain was that Vincent had become an obstacle to Cleveland's ambitions, and eliminating him would send a message to the Los Angeles family about the consequences of resistance. His death was business, nothing personal, though that distinction meant nothing to the man who had been executed in the basement of a building he had once managed. The investigation identified the likely perpetrators through a combination of historical records, informant testimony from decades past, and forensic analysis of construction records. The concrete seal that had entombed Vincent and his Cadillac had been poured by a crew connected to a construction company with known ties to Cleveland interests. The company had gone out of business in 1973, its records largely destroyed. but enough documentation survived to establish the connection. The men who had done the work were long dead, having met various ends in the violent world they inhabited. Carla Moretti's fate remained uncertain despite extensive investigation. No death certificate had ever been issued for her, and no record of her existence after January 1970 could be found under her married or maiden name. However, Vasquez discovered immigration records showing that a woman matching Carla's physical description had crossed into Mexico through Tijuana on January 15, 1970, traveling alone. The name on the documents was false, but the photograph bore a striking resemblance to Carla. If this was indeed her, she had escaped the fate that befell her husband and vanished into a new life. Whether Carla had been a victim or a conspirator became the subject of considerable debate as the case attracted media attention. Her family adamantly rejected any suggestion that she had been involved in Vincent's murder, insisting that she must have been abducted or coerced. But the evidence suggested a more complicated truth. The packed overnight bag in the Cadillac's trunk, the meetings with Cleveland operatives, the convenient escape to Mexico all pointed to premeditation. Perhaps Carla had seen an opportunity to escape a marriage to a man whose violent world was closing in, and had taken it regardless of the cost. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department officially closed the Moretti case in March of 2025, 55 years after the original missing persons report. The case was classified as a homicide, with Vincent Moretti identified as the victim. No perpetrators were named, all potential suspects having died long before the discovery of the remains. The case of Carla Moretti was reclassified from missing person to whereabouts unknown, acknowledging the evidence, suggesting she had survived, but declining to characterize her as either victim or suspect. The ambiguity was unsatisfying, but honest. Vincent Moretti's remains were released to his surviving family members in April of 2025. His nephew, Michael Moretti, 62 years old and living in Arizona, made arrangements for a funeral mass at St. Peter's Italian Catholic Church in Los Angeles, the same church where Vincent and Carla had been married 65 years earlier. The service was small, attended by a handful of elderly relatives and a few curious observers who had followed the case in the news. Father Anthony Calabrese offered prayers for Vincent's soul and spoke of mercy and redemption, carefully avoiding any mention of the circumstances of his death. The burial took place at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, where Vincent was laid to rest near the graves of his parents. The simple headstone bore only his name, dates of birth and death, and the inscription, "Finally at rest." His nephew chose not to include any mention of Carla, uncertain whether she deserved recognition as a grieving wife or condemnation as a betrayer. That question would likely never be answered with certainty. Whatever Carla's role in the events of January 1970, she had carried her secrets with her into whatever life she had lived after leaving Los Angeles. The 1967 Cadillac Coupe de Ville was donated to the Peterson Automotive Museum in Los Angeles, where it underwent careful preservation rather than restoration. The museum accepted the vehicle as a historical artifact, a tangible connection to the era of mob-connected nightclubs and organized crime that had once defined certain neighborhoods of the city. The Venetian blue paint was cleaned but not repainted. The white leather interior preserved in its deteriorated state. The entire vehicle presented as it had been found. A small plaque explained its history without sensationalizing the violence it had witnessed. The Harper Building was demolished in June of 2025, its secrets finally extracted and its structure deemed too compromised for renovation. The development company built a modern condominium complex on the site, 6 stories of luxury apartments with underground parking where the sealed basement had once held Vincent Moretti's remains. None of the future residents would know the history of the ground beneath their building, the violence that had occurred there half a century before their arrival. Los Angeles had always been good at burying its past, and this was just one more layer added to the sediment of memory. The story of Vincent and Carla Moretti joined the long catalog of organized crime mysteries that had accumulated throughout Los Angeles history. Unlike some cases that achieved lasting notoriety, the Moriartys would likely fade into obscurity once the media attention subsided. They had been minor figures in a minor family, their deaths significant only to those who had known them and to the historians who documented the era. But for 54 years, Vincent had waited in that basement, his Cadillac, his coffin, his story untold. The truth, or at least as much of it as could be recovered, had finally come to light. Rest in peace, Vincent Moretti. Your long wait in the darkness is over. Your family finally knows where you have been all these years. The Sunset Strip has given up one more of its buried secrets, and you are finally where you should have been all along. At rest, beside your parents, in consecrated ground. Your story remembered even if it can never be fully understood. Whatever sins you committed in life, you have paid for them many times over. May you find in death the peace that eluded you in those final frightened months of your life.